He thought he had learned that every secret eventually revealed itself, but nothing prepared him for the truth hidden beneath a simple sleeve. The executive boardroom overlooked the heart of downtown Chicago, where sunlight reflected against towering glass buildings and poured through floor-to-ceiling windows onto a polished walnut conference table. 12 senior executives sat quietly reviewing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, each waiting for one man's approval before another decision could move forward. Ethan Moretti entered the room without rushing, his charcoal suit perfectly tailored, his expression calm, and his presence alone enough to silence every private conversation. He never demanded respect because he had earned it long ago. At the opposite end of the room stood Danielle Brooks, his black secretary, already arranging presentation folders with the effortless precision that had made her indispensable over the past 3 years. Every page rested perfectly aligned. Every meeting began exactly on time. Every unexpected problem somehow disappeared before anyone else even noticed it existed. She never sought attention. She simply made excellence look ordinary. Her wardrobe never changed except for its colors. Whether Chicago welcomed heavy snow in January or 90-degree afternoons in July, Danielle always wore elegant long-sleeve blouses. New employees occasionally found it unusual, but experienced staff members had stopped asking questions years earlier. She was private, respectful, and remarkably professional, and everyone assumed that was simply who she was. The meeting began with discussions about investment proposals, expansion plans, and legal agreements. Ethan listened carefully while Danielle moved quietly around the room collecting signatures and distributing updated reports. She reached across the conference table to hand a revised contract to one of the executives when the metal clasp of a leather briefcase accidentally caught the cuff of her sleeve. The fabric slipped upward before she could react. For one brief moment, thin silver scars stretched across the dark skin of her forearm beneath the afternoon light. Danielle instinctively pulled the sleeve back into place almost as quickly as it had fallen. Most people lowered their eyes, pretending they had noticed nothing. Others awkwardly returned their attention to the paperwork in front of them. The room became strangely still. Ethan did not look away. His blue eyes remained fixed not on the scars themselves, but on the expression that crossed Danielle's face. It lasted less than a second, yet it revealed something far more painful than the marks she had hidden. It was the look of someone who had spent years believing that being discovered was more frightening than being misunderstood. Ethan slowly rose from his chair. No one else moved. No one dared interrupt the silence that settled across the room like a heavy curtain. Danielle tightened her grip on the folder in her hands, her breathing steady only because she had practiced appearing calm for longer than anyone could imagine. Ethan spoke so quietly that no one would mistake his words for anger, yet every person around the table heard them with absolute clarity. "Who did this to you?" The question lingered in the air long after his voice faded. Danielle opened her mouth, but no words came. Around the table, experienced executives exchanged uncertain glances, realizing that every contract, every financial projection, and every business objective had suddenly become meaningless. Ethan had never asked an employee about personal matters before. He respected boundaries too much for that. Yet something inside him refused to ignore what he had just seen. Danielle lowered her eyes, gently gathered the remaining documents, and forced herself to continue the meeting as though nothing unusual had happened. Her voice remained steady while explaining the next agenda item, but her hands held each folder just a little tighter than before. Ethan said nothing else for the remainder of the meeting. Instead, he watched the woman who had quietly organized his professional life for 3 years and realized that despite seeing her every single day, he had never truly seen her at all. The conference room gradually emptied, yet the silence Ethan carried with him lingered far longer than the meeting itself. Executives returned to their offices discussing quarterly forecasts and expansion strategies, but his thoughts refused to follow them. Instead, they remained fixed on a single image that lasted no more than a heartbeat. The brief glimpse of scars that Danielle had hidden with such practiced speed that it was obvious she had done it countless times before. Ethan walked into his private office overlooking Lake Michigan and closed the door without asking his assistant to hold his calls, something he rarely did. His desk was immaculate, every file arranged with military precision, but his attention drifted toward a personnel folder resting in the corner of his screen. Danielle Brooks. 3 years of flawless performance reviews. Exceptional recommendations. Perfect attendance. No disciplinary issues. Every supervisor had described her with nearly identical words. Professional. Reliable. Intelligent. Composed. Yet as Ethan slowly read through the file again, he realized how little it actually revealed about the woman who managed nearly every detail of his professional life. There were no emergency family contacts beyond a single attorney. No social media accounts listed. No references to siblings, parents, or previous addresses beyond what was legally required. Even the employment history appeared unusually clean, as though every chapter before Chicago had been carefully folded away and locked behind an invisible door. Ethan was not a man who believed in coincidences. Years of leading complex negotiations had taught him that when information was absent, the absence itself often carried meaning. Across the hall, Danielle sat alone at her desk finishing correspondence as though the afternoon meeting had unfolded like any other. Her expression remained calm while she answered emails, confirmed appointments, and adjusted Ethan's calendar for the following week. Anyone walking past her workstation would have seen nothing unusual. She smiled politely when coworkers thanked her for her help. She reminded one executive about an upcoming conference in Boston. She arranged travel accommodations with the same quiet efficiency she displayed every day. Yet once the office grew quieter, she gently pulled the cuff of her blouse farther down her wrist before glancing toward the glass entrance, almost instinctively checking who might be watching. Ethan noticed the movement through the transparent wall separating his office from the executive floor. It was not fear that caught his attention. It was habit, the kind of habit built over years instead of days. Late that afternoon, he asked the human resources director to send him Danielle's original hiring documents, explaining only that he wanted to review long-term personnel records. The director seemed surprised but complied immediately. Within minutes, another file appeared on his desk. Ethan opened it expecting forgotten details. Instead, he found even less than before. A resume with remarkable qualifications. Verified education. Excellent references from respected employers. Everything was legitimate, yet almost nothing reached beyond the professional surface. It was as if Danielle had carefully constructed a new life brick by brick while making certain that no one could see the foundation beneath it. As evening settled over Chicago and office lights slowly disappeared one floor after another, Danielle gathered her belongings into a simple leather tote. Before leaving, she paused beside Ethan's office door to remind him of his breakfast meeting the following morning. Her voice was steady, her smile courteous, and for a brief moment, she looked exactly as she always had. Ethan thanked her, watching as she walked toward the elevator. Only after the doors quietly closed did he realize something else that had escaped everyone for years. In 3 full years, despite working only a few steps away from him every single day, Danielle had never once spoken a single sentence about herself. The next several days unfolded with the same quiet rhythm that had defined the executive offices for years, yet Ethan found himself noticing details that had somehow remained invisible despite working beside Danielle almost every day. It was never one dramatic moment that captured his attention. Instead, it was a collection of small habits that fit together like pieces of a puzzle, each one ordinary on its own but impossible to ignore once seen together. Every morning Danielle arrived before sunrise, always carrying the same leather tote and a cup of black coffee from the cafe across the street. She greeted the security officers by name, thanked the maintenance staff with genuine warmth, and prepared the executive floor before anyone else arrived. Her desk was always perfectly organized, every schedule updated, every meeting confirmed hours in advance. To everyone around her, she represented consistency itself. Yet Ethan began to recognize that her remarkable organization extended beyond work. Whenever she entered a conference room, her eyes quietly swept every corner before she sat down. She always selected the chair that allowed her to see the entrance without appearing obvious. If a visitor unexpectedly approached from behind, even with friendly intentions, her shoulders became tense for the briefest instant before relaxing again. The reaction disappeared so quickly that most people never noticed it, but once Ethan saw it, he could not stop seeing it. During a luncheon with potential investors, laughter filled the dining room as conversations drifted between business and family life. Danielle remained gracious and attentive while coordinating schedules and answering questions. Yet when one guest casually asked where she had grown up, she smiled politely and redirected the conversation toward the upcoming presentation without revealing a single personal detail. The transition felt effortless, practiced so naturally that no one considered it unusual except Ethan. Later that afternoon, he watched through his office window as employees prepared to leave for the evening. Some gathered in small groups, making dinner plans or joking about weekend activities. Danielle wished each of them a pleasant evening before waiting quietly near the reception area until most of the building had emptied. Only then did she walk toward the elevators alone. From the window, Ethan noticed something else. Instead of taking the shortest route across the parking structure to her car, she followed a longer path beneath brighter lights where security cameras covered every angle. Before unlocking her vehicle, she paused for a brief moment and calmly looked around the garage. There was no panic in her movements, only careful routine. It was the behavior of someone who believed awareness was as essential as breathing. The following morning, another small detail caught Ethan's attention. Danielle received a call on the office phone while reviewing his calendar. She glanced at the screen, and although her expression barely changed, she allowed the call to continue to voicemail without answering. A few seconds later, she quietly deleted the message without listening to it and returned to work as though nothing had happened. She never appeared distracted, never allowed emotion to interfere with her responsibilities, but an almost invisible sadness settled behind her eyes for the remainder of the morning. Ethan understood negotiations, contracts, and the hidden motives of powerful people, yet Danielle remained the one mystery he could not solve. The more he observed her quiet discipline, the less he believed the scars on her arm represented a single painful chapter. They seemed connected to an entire way of living that had reshaped every routine, every decision, and every silent glance toward a doorway. For the first time in many years, Ethan realized that protecting someone did not always begin with action. Sometimes it began with paying attention to the things everyone else had learned to overlook. Friday evenings usually brought a welcome sense of relief to the executive offices, but that week an unusual stillness settled over the building as employees finished their final assignments before the weekend. One by one, the lights across the upper floors disappeared until only a handful remained glowing against the Chicago skyline. Ethan stayed in his office reviewing documents that could easily have waited until Monday, though he knew the paperwork was not the real reason he had delayed leaving. Through the glass wall, he noticed Danielle at her desk, carefully organizing the following week's schedule with the same patience she brought to every task. Nothing about her movements suggested urgency, yet there was a quiet distance in her expression that had become increasingly familiar. Just as she slipped the final folder into her leather tote, the soft vibration of her cell phone echoed across the nearly empty office. She looked down at the screen. For the first time since Ethan had known her, the calm composure she carried so effortlessly seemed to disappear. Her face lost its color. She did not answer the call. She simply stared at the screen until it stopped ringing. A moment later, another notification appeared. Then another. Danielle slowly lowered herself into her chair as though her strength had quietly left her. She closed her eyes for only a second, taking one careful breath before placing the phone face down on the desk. Ethan walked out of his office without hesitation, stopping several feet away so that she would not feel cornered. She immediately stood, attempting the same professional smile she always offered. "Everything is ready for Monday," she said softly. "Your itinerary has already been updated." Ethan glanced at the untouched phone before looking back at her. "The calendar can wait." Danielle lowered her eyes. "I am fine." Ethan remained silent. Years of negotiating with powerful people had taught him that silence often invited more truth than another question. Several long seconds passed before Danielle quietly admitted, "Some days are simply more difficult than others." There was no anger in her voice and no request for sympathy. Only exhaustion carefully hidden beneath perfect manners. Ethan gently motioned toward the seating area near the windows overlooking the city. "Sit down for a minute." She hesitated before accepting, resting on the edge of the sofa while keeping her hands folded together in her lap. Outside, the evening traffic flowed like ribbons of white and red light beneath the growing darkness. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt respectful. Finally, Ethan broke it with a calm voice that carried neither curiosity nor judgment. "You do not owe me an explanation." Danielle looked at him with visible surprise. He continued, "I am not asking because you work for me. I am asking because no one should have to carry fear alone." The words seemed to settle over the room more gently than any reassurance she had heard in years. Danielle looked toward the window, blinking back emotions she had spent countless mornings teaching herself to hide before walking into the office. "Most people stop asking after they realize I will not answer," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "I am not most people." Another quiet moment passed before she reached for her phone with trembling fingers and turned the screen toward him without saying a word. The display showed several missed calls from an unfamiliar number with no voicemail attached. Nothing threatening appeared on the screen, yet the fear in her eyes revealed that the calls meant far more than anyone else could possibly understand. Ethan did not reach for the phone. He did not demand names or details. He simply looked back at Danielle and said, "Whenever you are ready to tell your story, you will not have to tell it by yourself." For the first time since he had met her, the carefully constructed walls around Danielle did not collapse. They simply opened enough to let a small measure of hope find its way inside. The city lights shimmered across the surface of Lake Michigan, while the office remained wrapped in a peaceful silence that neither Ethan nor Danielle seemed eager to disturb. The missed calls still rested unanswered on her phone, but for the first time they no longer controlled the entire room. Ethan had not demanded explanations, and that quiet respect slowly became the reason Danielle found the courage to speak. She kept her eyes on the skyline for several moments before taking a careful breath. "Danielle Brooks is not the name I was born with," she said softly. Ethan did not interrupt. He simply listened. "Several years ago, I left everything behind. My apartment, my job, my city, even my name. Starting over was the only way I knew to find peace again." Her voice remained calm, but every sentence carried the weight of memories she had spent years carefully placing out of sight. She explained that she had once believed kindness alone could solve every misunderstanding until she discovered that some relationships slowly replaced confidence with fear. There had been no single dramatic moment that changed everything. Instead, it happened little by little, through constant control, isolation, and the feeling that every decision required someone else's approval. By the time she realized how much of herself had disappeared, rebuilding her life meant beginning again somewhere no one knew her history. Chicago became that place. She earned new qualifications, accepted temporary jobs, and eventually found an opportunity inside Ethan's company, where she promised herself that her work would speak louder than her past ever could. She glanced briefly at the sleeves covering her arms before continuing. "The scars healed years ago. They are no longer what hurts." Ethan remained completely still. Danielle looked down at her hands. "What stays with you is wondering whether every unknown phone number means your peaceful life is about to disappear. You begin checking every doorway without realizing it. You memorize parking garages. You sit where you can see the entrance. After enough years, those habits stop feeling unusual. They simply become the way you live." Ethan finally understood why every movement she made seemed so deliberate. The careful routines he had observed were never signs of weakness. They were evidence of extraordinary resilience built one ordinary day at a time. Danielle gave a quiet smile that barely reached her eyes. "Most people think surviving means forgetting. It does not. It means learning how to keep moving even when the memories still follow you." Another silence settled between them, but this one felt lighter than before. She had not shared every detail, nor did Ethan expect her to. Trust was never created in a single conversation. It grew through patience, consistency, and the certainty that someone would remain present without demanding more than a person was ready to give. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice steady and reassuring. "Thank you for trusting me with something that was never easy to carry." Danielle nodded, surprised by how different those words felt from sympathy. They sounded like respect. As they prepared to leave the office, Ethan opened the door for her without another question. He understood that the conversation had not ended. It had only begun. Watching Danielle step into the hallway, he realized that the strongest people were often the ones who had quietly rebuilt an entire life, while making certain no one ever noticed how much it had cost them. Monday morning arrived with clear skies stretching above Chicago, and from the outside, nothing appeared different. Employees filled the executive floor with the familiar rhythm of conversations, ringing phones, and fresh coffee, while Danielle resumed her responsibilities with the same quiet professionalism that had earned everyone's respect. She greeted each colleague with her usual warm smile, finalized Ethan's schedule, and coordinated a series of meetings without missing a single detail. To anyone passing through the office, the previous Friday evening might never have happened. Yet Ethan now understood that behind every perfectly organized calendar stood a woman who had spent years organizing her entire life around the simple hope of feeling safe. He had given Danielle his word without making promises he could not keep, and he intended to honor it through actions instead of speeches. Before the first meeting of the day, Ethan invited the company's general counsel and director of corporate security into his office. The conversation remained brief, confidential, and entirely professional. He instructed them to review the anonymous calls Danielle had received, determine whether any workplace security concerns existed, and coordinate with the appropriate legal channels if necessary. He made one point unmistakably clear. Every action would remain within the law, every investigation would respect Danielle's privacy, and nothing would move forward without her knowledge or consent. His team understood immediately. They had worked with Ethan long enough to recognize that when he spoke with that level of quiet determination, protecting people had become more important than protecting profits. Later that afternoon, Ethan asked Danielle to step into his office. She entered carrying a folder of contracts, expecting another business discussion, but instead found 2 cups of coffee waiting on the small table beside the window. Ethan motioned toward the chair across from him. "There is no emergency," he said gently. "I only wanted you to know that I have asked our legal and security teams to look into the anonymous calls, but nothing will happen unless you are comfortable with it." Danielle looked at him with visible surprise. She had expected questions, perhaps even advice, but not permission. "You are giving me the choice," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "It is your life. You decide how much help you want. My responsibility is simply to make sure you know that help exists." Danielle lowered her eyes for a moment before offering the smallest smile he had ever seen from her. It was not the polished smile she wore for clients or executives. It was genuine, uncertain, and deeply human. "Thank you," she whispered. "Most people try to take control when they think they are protecting someone." Ethan answered with calm certainty. "Real protection begins by respecting the person you are trying to protect." Over the following days, small changes began to appear. Additional lighting was installed near the employee parking area as part of a scheduled safety improvement that attracted little attention. Security officers quietly increased their evening presence without singling anyone out. The legal department coordinated with Danielle regarding the unwanted calls and explained every available option without pressure or expectation. No dramatic announcements were made. No rumors spread through the office. Everything unfolded with dignity because Ethan believed that privacy was one of the greatest forms of respect a person could receive. Danielle noticed every thoughtful change, even the ones no one mentioned aloud. For the first time since arriving in Chicago, she realized she was no longer carrying the full weight of vigilance by herself. The burden had not disappeared overnight, but it had become lighter because someone had chosen to stand beside her without asking her to surrender her independence. Nearly 3 weeks passed, and the changes were so subtle that most employees never noticed them. Meetings continued on schedule, clients praised the company's efficiency, and the executive floor operated with the same quiet excellence it always had. Danielle remained the steady center of that rhythm, greeting everyone with kindness while managing responsibilities that seemed impossible for one person to handle alone. Yet beneath the surface, something else was changing. The anonymous calls that had once appeared almost every evening became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. Days turned into an entire week without a single unfamiliar number appearing on her phone. Danielle found herself staring at the silent screen more than once, almost unable to believe that the constant anticipation she had lived with for years had finally been interrupted. She never asked Ethan what his legal and security teams had discovered, and he never volunteered unnecessary details. What mattered was not who deserved blame. What mattered was that every appropriate legal step had been taken, every available safeguard had been strengthened, and every concern had been addressed through the proper channels with professionalism and respect. One afternoon, the company's general counsel met privately with Danielle to explain that the matter had been documented, the relevant telecommunications records had been reviewed where legally permitted, and additional protective measures had been established should any future harassment occur. She left the meeting carrying no dramatic announcement, only something far more valuable. She carried certainty. For the first time in many years, she knew she would not have to face uncertainty by herself. Ethan noticed the difference long before anyone else did. It appeared in moments so ordinary that another person might have overlooked them completely. Danielle no longer paused quite as long before leaving the office each evening. She stopped checking her phone every few minutes during long meetings. One morning, she accepted an invitation to join several coworkers for coffee before work instead of politely declining, as she always had. The laughter that reached Ethan's office through the hallway sounded different because, for the first time, Danielle was part of it. Even the security officers at the front entrance noticed that she walked through the lobby with a lighter step, greeting them with the same kindness as always, but without the invisible tension that had quietly accompanied every arrival and departure. Late one Friday afternoon, Ethan found Danielle standing beside the large windows overlooking the city after the final meeting of the week. The golden light of the setting sun reflected across the skyline, while traffic flowed peacefully beneath them. She turned toward him with a gentle smile. "I realized something today," she said. Ethan waited without interrupting. "When my phone stayed silent this afternoon, I did not notice until almost an hour later." She gave a small laugh at the thought. "That has never happened before." Ethan looked out across the city before answering. "Sometimes peace arrives so quietly that we only recognize it after it has already become part of our lives." Danielle nodded, her eyes bright with gratitude rather than sadness. "I spent so many years believing that safety was only temporary. I forgot it could become normal." Ethan smiled, not with pride, but with quiet satisfaction. He had never wanted recognition for helping her. Watching her begin to trust ordinary moments again was more meaningful than any expression of thanks. As they stood together overlooking Chicago, neither of them spoke for several minutes. They did not need to. The silence that once carried fear had slowly transformed into something entirely different. It had become the peaceful sound of a life no longer ruled by yesterday. Autumn gradually settled over Chicago, painting the city with warm shades of gold and amber, while life inside the executive offices continued with its familiar rhythm. The passing weeks no longer felt divided into moments before fear and after fear. Instead, they blended into ordinary days filled with meetings, conversations, deadlines, and quiet victories that once seemed impossible for Danielle to imagine. Healing had not arrived as one unforgettable moment. It had arrived through countless ordinary mornings that no longer began with anxiety. Ethan noticed the transformation in ways that could never be measured on a performance review. Danielle still arrived early each day, but now she occasionally stopped in the employee lounge to share coffee with coworkers before opening her calendar. She laughed more often, not loudly, but sincerely. She accepted invitations to team lunches instead of finding polite reasons to return to her desk. New employees quickly discovered that the person everyone admired for flawless organization also possessed remarkable patience. Whenever someone made a mistake, Danielle never embarrassed them. She quietly explained the correct procedure, shared practical advice, and reminded them that confidence was built one lesson at a time. Before long, younger employees naturally sought her guidance whenever they felt overwhelmed. They trusted her because she never judged uncertainty. She understood better than anyone that people often carried invisible burdens into the workplace. One afternoon, the Human Resources Department launched a voluntary mentoring program to help recent college graduates adjust to executive-level careers. Without drawing attention to herself, Danielle volunteered. Every Thursday afternoon, she met with small groups of new employees, answering questions about professional communication, organization, and workplace confidence. She rarely spoke about her own past, yet every piece of encouragement she offered seemed shaped by experiences no training manual could ever teach. One young assistant admitted she constantly worried about making mistakes. Danielle smiled gently and replied, "Perfection is not what earns respect. Showing up with integrity every day does." Those simple words stayed with everyone in the room long after the meeting ended. Ethan occasionally watched the mentoring sessions through the conference room windows, while walking between appointments. He saw employees leave those conversations standing a little taller than when they had entered. Danielle was no longer simply keeping the executive office running smoothly. She was quietly changing the culture around her. People became more patient with one another. Managers listened more carefully before making assumptions. Small acts of kindness spread naturally because someone had demonstrated them without asking for recognition. Late one evening, Ethan passed Danielle's office as she prepared to leave for the day. She was helping a new administrative assistant organize files for the following week's board meeting. The young employee thanked her repeatedly for staying late. Danielle smiled and said, "Someone once gave me the chance to rebuild my confidence. I am only passing that gift forward." Ethan paused outside the doorway for a brief moment before continuing down the hallway without interrupting them. Hearing those words confirmed something he had quietly hoped for ever since the evening she first trusted him with her story. Danielle was no longer measuring her future by what she had survived. She was measuring it by the lives she could now encourage. As she gathered her belongings and walked through the lobby that evening, the security officers greeted her with familiar smiles, and she returned them with genuine warmth. She stepped outside into the crisp Chicago air, looked across the glowing skyline, and realized that the city, which had once been nothing more than a place to disappear, had slowly become the place where she had finally learned how to belong. Spring arrived almost unnoticed, replacing the cold winds of Chicago with mornings filled with gentle sunshine that poured through the glass walls of the executive offices. Nearly a year had passed since the afternoon when a single unexpected moment changed two lives forever. The company was preparing to celebrate another successful year, and employees from every department gathered inside the spacious event hall overlooking the city skyline. Laughter echoed across the room as colleagues shared stories, welcomed new team members, and reflected on how much the organization had grown together. Ethan stood near the stage greeting guests with the calm confidence everyone expected from him, yet his attention drifted toward the entrance when Danielle stepped inside. For the first time since joining the company, she wore an elegant short-sleeved dress that reflected the warmth of the season. The silver lines on her forearms remained visible beneath the soft lights of the room, no longer hidden beneath carefully chosen fabric. Conversations continued without hesitation because no one was looking at her scars anymore. They were looking at the woman she had become. Danielle greeted co-workers with the same kindness that had always defined her, but something had changed beyond appearance. She walked with quiet confidence instead of careful caution. Her smile no longer looked rehearsed. It carried the peaceful certainty of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for surviving difficult chapters of life. Throughout the evening, several employees approached her to thank her for mentoring them during their first months with the company. One young assistant told her that she had almost resigned after making a costly scheduling mistake until Danielle patiently helped her rebuild her confidence. Another employee explained that Danielle's calm encouragement had inspired him to return to college while continuing to work full-time. Listening to their stories, Ethan realized that the greatest influence inside his company had never come from authority or titles. It had come from compassion practiced consistently every single day. Later that evening, Ethan was invited to say a few words before the celebration concluded. Standing before the employees, he spoke not about profits, expansion, or business achievements. Instead, he thanked every person in the room for creating a workplace where respect mattered more than position and character mattered more than reputation. Then he looked toward Danielle with a quiet smile. "There is someone here who reminds all of us that courage is not measured by what we hide," he said. "It is measured by how we choose to live after life asks us to begin again. Your scars tell people where you have been. Your courage tells them who you are." The room fell completely silent before warm applause gradually filled the hall. Danielle lowered her eyes for a brief moment, deeply moved, not because attention had finally found her, but because it no longer frightened her. She understood that no one in that room saw her as someone defined by old wounds. They saw a respected professional, a trusted mentor, and a woman whose quiet strength had changed countless lives without asking for recognition. As the celebration ended and the lights of Chicago shimmered beyond the windows, Ethan and Danielle stood for a moment overlooking the city that had witnessed both fear and healing. Neither of them spoke because there was nothing left that needed explaining. Some victories were never announced. They simply appeared in the ordinary freedom to smile, to trust, and to walk into tomorrow without looking over your shoulder. And on that quiet spring evening, everyone who knew Danielle remembered that true dignity is never found in a life without scars. It is found in the courage to stop letting those scars decide who you become.